Hello there, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. If you're here, it likely means you're ready to drift off. Perhaps not just to sleep, but to a time far, far removed from emails, alarms, and awkward small talk in elevators. Tonight, we'll journey gently back through time, but not to kings or conquests. No dragons, no dramatic betrayals, no shouting across moats. Instead, we'll explore the quiet truths, the unseen lives, the soft sound behind the walls of a medieval fortified town, the kinds of stories that never made it into your textbooks because they were simply too ordinary, too slow, too deeply human. Behind those stone ramparts and creaking gates, life didn't always look like a painting of battle. It looked more like boiled turnips with smoke, a cat sleeping in a basket of straw, and the sound of someone sweeping yesterday's mud off a wooden doorstep. So tonight, let's settle in and wander the cobbled lanes of a town forgotten by glory, but alive with little details. We'll explore how people lived, what they worried about, what they smelled each morning, and who fed the chickens. All told at a pace as slow and soft as the flickering light of a tallow candle. Before we begin, if this kind of sleepy storytelling helps you rest, you're welcome to subscribe or leave a comment about where in the world you're listening from. No pressure at all. Just something to let the YouTube spirits know you're out there. Now then, let your eyes grow heavier, your thoughts grow slower, and let's step to the town gates, into a world where the walls didn't just keep danger out. They kept quiet history in. Let your eyes grow heavy as we begin our slow walk through time. You've entered a world where the air is still, and the stones beneath your feet remember stories long forgotten. The sun is setting over a low ridge, casting a gentle gold across the mossy walls of a medieval town. Not the kind told in heroic legends, but the kind quietly lived in. Tonight, we step into a fortified town, not as travelers or tourists, but as invisible guests, unseen observers slipping quietly between moments, drifting between ages. This isn't a tale of swords and sieges. No trumpets here, no raging armies. What we're after is something far more tender. The day-to-day life behind stone walls, where real people lived, whispered, worked, and sometimes just waited. These fortified towns, surrounded by high walls, built with aching backs and weather-worn hands, weren't always fortresses of drama. In truth, they were small pockets of rhythm, order, and quiet fear. They kept the wilderness at bay, but they also kept people within rules, routines, and rituals as solid as the stone that shaped them. Let's not imagine sprawling castles or lavish banquets. Let's imagine narrow alleyways between tilted houses, the slow sweep of a broom across a muddy doorstep, and the creak of a wooden shutter against the wind, a stray cat curled on a rooftop, a sleepy candle burning low beside a parchment letter never sent. We'll begin at the walls, the edges of this enclosed world. Imagine walking alongside them now. You place your hand on the rough limestone surface, cool, silent, and unbothered by time. From outside, they must have looked imposing, but from inside, they were just there, silent companions to life, like hills or rivers, something ever present, but no longer noticed. Inside these walls, generations passed quietly. Children were born. Chickens pecked dust in the square, and old women gossiped beneath archways worn by the same footsteps day after day. Behind the defense and discipline was a softer heartbeat, one of survival, routine, and modest joys. You might wonder, were they safer in here? Yes, sometimes. But walls can protect and also press in. For every arrow repelled, there were curfews to follow, gates that locked at sunset, and freedom slowly traded for shelter. Living inside meant adapting to limits, to a life arranged in narrow rows and wooden beams. We'll wander these rows together, slowly. We'll meet bakers, tanners, bored guards, laughing children, and tired mothers. We'll follow market carts as they rattle down cobbled lanes. We'll listen in on whispered gossip and stories passed down at dusk. Nothing loud, nothing grand, just quietly human. So let the world outside fall away now. There are no alerts, no emails, no noise here. Just a sleeping town, walled in, waiting for morning. And we, as the sleepy historian's companions, will simply drift behind its shutters and hear what's been forgotten. When we picture medieval fortified towns, the mind tends to leap toward scenes of clashing swords, flaming arrows, grand duels on parapets, and heroes rushing across drawbridges. It's easy to imagine every day was brimming with danger or drama, echoing with horns of war, the stomp of boots, or the tense silence before a siege. And yet, for the people who actually live behind those towering walls, most days were extraordinarily quiet. Not quiet like a library, but quiet like a field after harvest. Quiet like rain on rooftops while someone inside stirs soup. The walls weren't built just for drama. They were built for predictability. They were meant to reduce surprise, to shelter the ordinary. And that's exactly what they did. There were no dragons here, no constant threats. Just weather, neighbors, creaking carts, and the daily shuffle of human life. In fact, much of the time, the greatest threat to one's peace came not from invaders, but from boredom. Children would pace the narrow lanes looking for anything interesting. Old men leaned against the stone wells, telling the same tales they'd told for decades. Housewives stirred the same pots with the same herbs, day after day. That monotony was not a failure of imagination. It was a sign of peace. In fact, if a traveler arrived and described some harrowing event from a neighboring region, a burned mill, a bandit ambush, a skirmish in the hills, the townsfolk would listen in awe, not envy. They lived with walls not because they loved them, but because walls made life slower, steadier, and safer. The misconception, then, is this, that life inside a fortified town was always about survival. In truth, it was usually about routine. Fetching water from the same well, sitting on the same wooden bench, sweeping the same stone stoop at dawn. Even the sounds reflected that: the bark of the same dog, the call of the bell at the same hour. Inside these walls, danger was a concept, not a daily reality. And perhaps that's why the people slept so soundly. Here are your 3 image prompts for Segment 1, Part 2, Misconceptions versus Mundane Realities. Crafting your visual style for boring history for sleep, unseen truths behind the walls of medieval fortified town. You're lying in bed now, warm and still. Let your eyes rest. Let your mind drift gently through time, past the noise of the present day. Imagine you quietly arrived in a town surrounded by stone and silence. Inside these walls, life moves at the rhythm of the sun and the sound of footsteps on worn stone paths. The very walls that once echoed with the clang of hammers and the barked orders of soldiers now breathe with a quieter purpose. Protection, certainly, but also a kind of gentle confinement. They are not ominous. Not anymore. They are simply there, part of the air you breathe. You notice first the stillness. Not silence, no. That would be too simple. The sound are small, tucked gently into corners of routine. A fire crackling low inside a modest home. The shuffling of feet over wooden floors. A distant cough. A rooster that seems to crow too late in the day. And somewhere always, a creaking wooden wheel or the slow rhythmic clip of hooves as a cart lazily bumps along the narrow, uneven streets. No shouting. No rushing. No urgent business. Here, the sounds don't fight to be heard. They simply exist, saw companions to time's passing. The walls themselves are not cold and empty. They are thick, yes, often damp, but also alive in a way, draped in ivy, warmed by sun, sheltering little lives in every crack and crevice. Sparrows nest between stones. Moss creeps slowly upward like it has nowhere better to be. Children grow up not wondering what lies beyond. Most of them never even think to ask. The outside world is a rumor. Life unfolds in simple loops. The market square grows noisy only on certain days. The baker rises early, though his bread is rarely rushed. The streets smell faintly with smoke, packed earth, and sheep. And every wall casts a shadow, not a metaphorical one, but a literal one across the paths, homes, and courtyards. People live in relation to those shadows. They hang their laundry in the slivers of afternoon sun. They tend herbs where the warmth lingers, and they gather in spaces the wind avoids. The rhythms of life in a walled town are shaped not by alarm bells or ambitions, but by the quiet necessities of staying fed, warm, and connected to small community within arm's reach. At night, the heavy gates close with a groan. It's not ominous. It's just a sound everyone knows, a sigh from the old bones of the town saying, "That's enough for today." And then the world inside folds into itself like a blanket. Lamps flicker behind shutters. Footsteps become fewer. And the walls, so firm and ancient, hum with a sleepy kind of silence. Inside those walls, the day began slowly, just as the embers from the hearth were coaxed back to life. Most people in a medieval fortified town didn't wake to the ringing of bells or rooster crows, but rather the gentle sounds of stirring. A pot clanking against a stone, the whisper of hands brushing kindling into the fireplace, or the thud of a door opening to fetch the day's first water. It wasn't glamorous, but there was a rhythm to it, a rhythm that echoed every single day. Breakfast wasn't hurried. It was humble, often nothing more than bread dipped in yesterday's broth, cold or warmed, depending on how much fuel was left. The lucky might have onions or salted bits of pork. Most just had barley cakes or hard brown loaves, softened in liquid. Children would eat whatever the adults gave them without question. There weren't choices and no menus. Only what had been preserved, stored, or scavenged. And preservation, that was a whole affair of its own. You see, in a fortified town, where space was limited and safety was prioritized, storing food was as much about cleverness as it was about custom. Grain, for instance, was prized like gold, stored in dry, elevated bins, protected from rats and moisture. A leaky roof could mean hunger 2 seasons from now. Salted meats were common, hung up in cellars to dry, or packed in barrels thick with coarse salt. Vegetables were pickled or fermented in stone jars sealed with wax or tallow. Cheese, the hard kind, was a savior. It kept through seasons, gave protein, and didn't need a fire to be enjoyed. And the fire, well, it was the center of everything. The hearth wasn't just for warmth. It was the kitchen, the living room, the light, and the occasional dryer. Women, most often it was women, managed the flames with great skill. Firewood was precious, so they learned to simmer stews slowly, to reuse heat, to warm stones and use them in beds, or even under water jars to delay freezing. A day without fire was a hard day indeed. Now, managing water and waste, that's a bit more complicated and far less glamorous. Water, especially clean water, wasn't always guaranteed. Townsfolk relied on wells, usually a few scattered throughout the town. Long, creaking wooden arms or thick rope-wrapped buckets were common. The walk to the well and back was often a morning ritual. If the town was near a river or stream, it might have one gate just for fetching water, but during tense times, even that became risky. Rain barrels were common too, often tucked beneath eaves to catch runoff. Some towns had rudimentary systems, stone gutters and clay pipes, though these were rare luxuries and often clogged or cracked. The smell on hot days was unforgettable. And then there was waste. In smaller homes, chamber pots were the standard. Simple clay or metal pots tucked under beds or benches, emptied in the morning into cesspits, backyard corners, or, if you were careless, simply tossed into the street. Yes, really. Larger buildings might have what were called garderobes, little overhanging toilet rooms built along outer walls, allowing waste to drop into a pit or moat below. Monasteries and castles sometimes had more advanced setups, with covered channels to carry waste away from the main buildings. But in towns, things were usually much simpler and smellier. You'd often see townsfolk with buckets of ash or sand. These were scattered over smelly patches or tossed into latrines to keep things bearable. Children were sometimes given the chore of emptying the pot, not the most charming of duties, but a fact of life. And then there were the animals. Because yes, animals lived inside the walls too. Chickens wandered freely through back courtyards. Pigs rooted near kitchens. Goats were tethered beside homes. Their waste mixed with human waste. Flies were frequent guests. And yet, somehow, the people adapted. Their noses learned to live with it. Their routines developed around it. There were town cleaners, sometimes paid in bread or small coins, who'd rake up manure or sweep refuse into carts. In some places, this work was done as a form of punishment, a legal sentence for petty crimes. Imagine that. Cleaning the streets as part of your penance, walking past your neighbors who knew why you were scraping muck that morning. But still, life went on. There was a certain dignity in it all, a quiet strength. These weren't glamorous lives, but they were persistent, practical, and rich with small adaptations passed down over generations. And as the hearth crackled back to life in the early hours, and the pot began to bubble with the day's first stew, the whole town seemed to exhale together. Another day survived, another fire kindled, another story added to the unseen truth behind those thick stone walls. In the rhythm of life within a fortified town, food was not merely fuel, it was ritual. It was a heartbeat of the household, the quiet pulse of the day, a steady companion in the silence behind the walls. Most meals were humble and repetitive, yet comforting in their routine. The townsfolk rose with the sun, and their first meal was often a warm porridge made from barley or oats. It was ladled into simple wooden bowls, sometimes sweetened with dried fruits or honey if one were fortunate. Bread, dark and dense, was ever present, baked in communal ovens that shared their warmth with the street outside. The smell of freshly baked loaves was one of the few joys that drifted out beyond shuttered windows on a cold morning. Water wasn't always safe to drink, especially within crowded walls. So warm drinks like ale or weak beer were common even at breakfast. They were low in alcohol, brewed quickly, and safer than the murky well water. Children, too, drank it, though theirs was even more diluted. Midday brought the main meal, when the sun was highest and labor was briefly set aside. Stews were favored, one-pot meals of beans, cabbage, onions, and, when available, cuts of meat or bones for flavor. These simmered slowly over the hearth, filling the home with earthy aromas. It wasn't a feast. It was a necessity, reliable, nourishing, and, above all, quiet in its preparation. Food waste was rare. Every scrap had purpose. Bones were boiled for broth. Bread crusts became thickeners. Even fish heads found their way into soups. The town lived in a kind of culinary thrift that modern times might not appreciate, but which was born of wisdom, not just want. The act of eating itself was structured but unceremonious. Families gathered around low tables, often without chairs, sitting on benches or mats. There were no forks. Fingers and knives sufficed. Hands were wiped on coarse cloths or simply on one's tunic. There was little conversation, just the sounds of chewing, of bowls being passed, of wooden spoons scraping the bottom for the last bit of warmth. And in the evening, a light supper closed the day. Cold leftovers or another small portion of porridge, perhaps with a bit of hard cheese. Candles flickered as families settled into night, the glow of firelight casting shadows across satisfied, if tired, faces. This repetition, day after day, year after year, created a rhythm that shaped memory and identity. People didn't just live behind walls. They ate behind them. And in that shared sustenance, behind thick stone and wooden beams, they found continuity and comfort. Food may not have been plentiful, but it was familiar. And sometimes, when the evening stew tasted just right and the winter wind couldn't reach the hearth, it even felt like peace. The tools of medieval life were not many, but those that existed were cherished, repaired, and passed on through generations like heirlooms of quiet importance. A blacksmith's hammer, worn smooth at the grip, a wooden ladle stained from years of broth and porridge, a loom creaking softly in the back room as twilight settled over the stone walls. Tools weren't just objects. They were woven into the rhythm of the day, each carrying stories in their worn handles and chipped edges. You might imagine mornings beginning with the slow scrape of a knife on a whetstone, a father sharpening it not in a rush, but with an almost meditative calm. Children watching as sparks occasionally flickered, the rhythm of stone against metal becoming a lullaby of its own. In the carpenter's shed, curls would fall like soft petals to the floor. The smell of pine and oak hung in the air, fresh, sharp, and earthy. Tools were few, but each was precious. A chisel handed down from a grandfather, a hammer bound in leather to soften its handle, a bucket of nails sorted by hand. The pace of labor was slow, partly by necessity and partly by design. A slower pace was safer, more deliberate, and less wasteful. There was no concept of productivity as we know it today. Time was the canvas upon which skill was painted. And as the sun dipped behind the ramparts, a different kind of tool emerged: storytelling. Gathered by the hearth, families would rest after the day's toil. The flicker of firelight danced on rough stone walls and sleepy eyes. There were no books to read, no clocks to chase, just stories. Some were grand, tales of knights and dragons passed from traveler to villager. Others were humble, rooted in the rhythms of the town itself. A neighbor who once wrestled a pig in the market square. A grandmother's dream that foretold a good harvest. A whispered joke about the constable's strange shoes. Tools of survival gave way to tools of connection. The warmth of a shared blanket, the hum of a lullaby, the gentle rhythm of someone's breath as they nodded off beside the fire. In these small moments, time softened. It didn't matter that the world outside the town walls was often wild and uncertain. Inside, there was comfort in the ordinary, safety in routine, and beauty in the slow, deliberate ways of living. The town's tools told its story, not just through wood and iron, but through voice and silence, warmth and rest, touch and memory. And in the background, always, the subtle crackle of the fire, the low murmur of a tale half remembered, the shifting shadows that seemed to breathe with the walls. Soon, sleep would come, not in a rush, but gently like a whisper passed from one generation to the next. You might imagine that life inside a medieval fortified town was loud or chaotic, all grit and gritstone. But really, most days were quietly repetitive. If you stood at the corner of a narrow street and simply listened, you'd hear a tapestry of soft sounds, distant buckets being filled, the call of a neighbor leaning from an upper window, the quiet groan of a wheelbarrow being pulled over stone. Let's slow it all down and peek into the delicate, unseen rituals of community. Not the battles or town criers, but the mutual nods, shared chores, and rhythms of lives closely lived. There were no fences between people here. Not really. Houses leaned into each other like old friends, joined by beams, rafters, and occasional footbridge overhead. The very construction of these towns encouraged togetherness. If you lived on the west end of the Baker's Lane, you probably smelled sourdough by dawn. And if you didn't own a well, You knew which neighbor would lend their bucket. Early morning was a time of routine cooperation. Women might gather at the shared washhouse or riverbank, scrubbing linens on angled stones, pausing to share a bit of gossip, or to hum a song passed down from a grandmother. Children would chase hens together in the open yard behind the grain merchant's house, laughing at their own daring. You find elderly men sitting on stoops, slowly carving small bits of wood into toys or prayer tokens, and passing them on to anyone who needed a gift for a child or a favor repaid. These weren't acts of charity, just the quiet hum of society that knew how to share burdens, and didn't mind if the rhythm of life meant pausing often. Tasks were often too big for one person alone. If someone was thatching their roof, neighbors came by, one would pass up reeds. Another would hammer down new bundles. No one was paid in coin. Help was banked and repaid with warm bread, or help shoveling mud in the next rain. In winter, communal tasks were even more pronounced. Firewood was gathered collectively, often hauled in bundles from outside the walls. If one family's stores were low, others would leave some logs quietly by the door, sometimes even before dawn, without a word. Market days were a bit livelier, though even then, the bustle was local and familiar. Vendors helped each other set up their stalls. A cabbage farmer might watch another's goods while they slipped away to tend to a sick child. Bartering was done in slow conversation, not heated haggling. Everyone knew everyone's name, and if not, they knew who their uncle was. It was rare for a person to be truly alone here. Even silence had a companionable texture. When you walked home at dusk, the light from others' candles spilled from shutters. You could hear the distant murmur of a lullaby or the soft clink of spoons against bowls. These weren't loud gestures of community, but they were deeply woven. They made the fortified town feel less like a fortress and more like a single longhouse, a shared roof stretched over many hearts. While life within the walls of a fortified town was often simple and repetitive, it was also stitched together by countless small acts of kindness, quiet gestures that rarely made it into grand historical records, but shaped the soul of the town more than any battle or treaty ever could. These were the human moments, the smiles passed in the morning markets, the loaves of bread shared with a widow whose oven had failed, the neighbor who showed up without asking, just in time to help lift a beam or fetch water during a dry season. Celebrations, too, wove their way through the rhythm of town life, not grand or wild, but gently spirited. There were feast days and saints' days, sure, the kind of events where candles were lit, herbs were strewn on the floor of the church, and villagers wore their cleanest tunics and cloaks. But perhaps the most cherished were the smaller observances, the harvest gatherings in the town square, with quiet music and shared stew, or the child's name day, where even a few borrowed apples and a carved whistle could become the makings of a party. One can imagine, even now, the slow joy of such an evening. A circle of townsfolk gathering as the sun dipped behind the ramparts, someone producing a reed pipe or fiddle, a gentle clapping rhythm starting, not for performance, but for companionship. These celebrations were soft and shared, the opposite of the roaring medieval feasts we might see in films. They were private joys made public in the safest of ways. There were other acts of resilience, too, ones that did not involve music or firelight. A cobbler quietly adding an extra patch to a poor child's shoes, unpaid. A stonemason adjusting his day's labor to help repair a neighbor's cracked threshold. The apothecary who never asked payment from a woman whose husband had died on the wall patrol. These were not grand, but they were deeply good, and they added weight to the quiet sense of interdependence, that behind every fortified wall stood not just defenses, but decency. Sometimes, when the weather turned and the clouds sat low over the town like a woolen blanket, the entire town felt slower, closer. People moved more deliberately, their voices softened. These were the moments where someone would leave a warm flask of broth on another's doorstep, where older townsfolk would sit together in silence, just watching the hearthlight dance on the wall. Moments when kindness required no reason at all. Even within the strongest stone walls, true protection came from community, from knowing that someone would notice your absence at the market, would ask after your child, would press an extra apple into your hand on a hard day. It wasn't a perfect world. There were disputes, jealousies, pettiness. But even those passed more gently than we might expect. Apologies delivered with bread. Arguments settled over shared labor. This quiet form of emotional architecture may not be visible in the ruins of walled towns today, but it was just as sturdy and just as essential as the mortar between the stones. Now, imagine yourself among them. You've lit a small candle in your simple home. Outside, soft music plays. You hear laughter from a nearby doorway, and the smell of fresh-baked barley bread floats in through the shutters. You lean back, safer than the stone, and know, here, you are not alone. In the hush of early morning, before the stirrings of chores or market calls, there were moments of stillness, moments where life inside a fortified town offered its gentlest gifts. Let us wander now, slowly and drowsily, into the quieter joys that wove through medieval town life. They were not loud or lavish. They were often fleeting, modest, and entirely overlooked by grander tales. And yet, they were the soul of the place. Festivals arrived like dreams in the midst of long sameness. Not grand affairs as one might imagine today, but simple processions with garlands woven from meadow flowers and old songs sung off-key by villagers who knew the tune by heart, but not always the words. The feast days were a welcome interruption, times when even the sternest cobbler or strictest will trader might smile over spiced bread or a flask of warm cider. Banners sewn from faded scraps fluttered in the soft breeze, and the market stalls, for once, were piled not with necessity, but with color and cheer. Children, with bare feet and threadbare tunics, played with nothing more than their own laughter and bits of twine. They turned sticks into horses, stones into treasure, and narrow alleys into kingdoms. If you paused by a courtyard wall, you might hear their shrieks of delight echoing between the stone. There were no rules, no referees, only the quiet understanding that before supper and before the church bell tolled the hour, there was time to imagine. And then the weather, the weather, the town's oldest companion. Each season left its gentle thumbprint on the rhythms of joy. In spring, small flower markets brought hints of green hope along cobbled streets, still slick from winter. Summer evenings lingered with cool shadows and the sweet hum of insects as townsfolk sat quietly on wooden steps, fanning themselves with folded cloth and trading idle gossip as stars blinked above. Autumn brought the scent of firewood and the crunch of dried leaves underfoot, the sound of cider bubbling in iron pots, and the soft rustle of preparations for colder days. And winter, though bitter, offered the softest silences of all. Snow blanketed the rooftops, and inside, families huddled around dim hearths, swapping worn stories that warmed the heart more than the flames ever could. It was in these ordinary joys, a well-cooked turnip, a child's pebble collection, the soft brushing of frost on a window pane, that the true life of the fortified town revealed itself, not in conquest or glory, but in the slow, safe pulse of shared moments. Even in the tightest of walls, joy found room to stretch, yawn, and settle in. When the first offensive walls were raised around small medieval towns, they were often made not of grand stone, but of timber, just thick, roughly hewn logs set upright in a trench, tied together, filled with earth or mud. Nothing too impressive at first glance, and yet for many, it was a first line of safety, a barrier between their fragile world and the greater unknown. Let's imagine ourselves now in such a place, a sleepy, humble town, still new to the idea of needing protection. Its people likely saw danger not as a constant, but as a distant, occasional whisper. Raiders? Perhaps wild animals, possibly troubled nobles on horseback, on rare occasion. But most of the time, that wooden palisade stood quietly, weathered by rain, sometimes mended with rope or patches, often leaning slightly like tired shoulders after a long day. Over time, as settlements grew and tensions stirred, not always from external threats, but sometimes from the ambitions of rival lords or disputes over grain and land, the need for stronger defenses became more than a thought. It became a reality etched into budgets, town meetings, and the dreams of craftsmen. And so came the shift to stone. It wasn't immediate. No medieval town simply tore down its timber walls overnight. Instead, you'd often see a wooden wall slowly being replaced section by section. A stonemason would work quietly, perhaps with a handful of apprentices, stacking limestone or granite in uneven lines, wetting it with lime mortar, and muttering under his breath about weather or wages. The process could take decades. Entire generations might live behind half-wood, half-stone walls, a living timeline embedded into their surroundings. Children might play a game where they run their fingers from the rough splinters of old oak planks to the smoother, colder stone, not realizing they were tracing centuries of transformation. Stone brought more than durability. It brought height. A stone tower could rise above the market square, a lookout for potential invaders, or simply a quiet place for the town watch to nap under cloudy skies. And with height came a strange kind of comfort. People felt safer, even if the only danger they'd seen in years was a loose cow or a drunken fight over turnips. Some towers were square, some round, choices made by architects who may never have seen an enemy approach. But still they built, not with urgency, but with care. Each stone block had to be shaped and placed, often with imperfect tools, and certainly with more patience and ambition. As you drift further into thought, picture a mason's dusty hands, the slow rhythm of his chisel, and the way echoes linger between scaffolding and stone. These walls didn't just protect, they became part of the town's identity. Something to lean against in the afternoon sun, something to pass on your way to buy bread, something to grow moss and legend at the same time. And inside these walls, life simply continued. Whether timber or stone, the purpose was never just defense. It was containment of stories, of secrets, of shared meals and old songs. These walls heard laughter, grief, boredom, gossip. They bore witness to lives that history didn't write down, the ones too ordinary to record, yet far too real to forget. And so, the walls grew taller, stronger, quieter. Let's pause here and picture what that transformation might have looked like. Not with drama, but with patience. The kind that puts you gently to sleep as you imagine stones being placed under slow gray skies. Behind the mighty stone walls and towering battlements of a medieval fortified town lay a quieter, less visible layer of life, a world not often sung about in stories or etched in the pages of grand chronicles. It was a realm of planners, engineers, and repairmen, the unseen hands who held the very idea of a safe town together. While knights posed stoically in armor and town leaders spoke in courts, these men dealt in measurements, mortar, and mental maps. They were thinkers, problem solvers, and maintainers, humble in their role, but monumental in their contribution. Let us now imagine ourselves beside one of them. He's not wearing shining armor. Instead, he adjusts a dusty cap and rolls up his linen sleeves, smudged with charcoal and chalk. He squints up at a jagged crack in the wall and begins to draw a plan on a wooden tablet. It's early morning. The town hasn't quite woken up yet. But for him, the work has already begun. Brick, every stone in the wall, every corner in the tower was placed not just with muscle, but with intention. Medieval fortifications were marvels of planning. Though primitive by today's standards, they were not random piles of rock. They followed blueprints, sometimes etched onto cloth, sometimes drawn onto wooden planks, sometimes even committed entirely to memory by master builders. There were ratios to consider: the angle of a curtain wall to deflect incoming missiles, the height of a tower to see far enough without making it too heavy to support itself, the depth of a foundation, the slope of a moat. None of it was improvised. It was, in every sense, engineered. You might picture silence around this process, but it was often quite the opposite. Repair days were filled with shouts between workers, the clinking of chisels on stone, the scraping of ropes being hoisted, the thud of wooden scaffolding. Still beneath that noise, there was a deeper quiet of thought, the murmur of minds solving puzzles centuries ahead of their time. Sometimes a town's defenses were damaged not by war but by time. Harsh winters would widen gaps in the mortar. Rain would erode the outer surfaces. And once every few years, storms could knock loose entire sections of wall. When that happened, a quiet sort of emergency would unfold. No alarm bells, no panic, just hurried footfalls and fast assembling of tools. The planner, the engineer, the stone supplier, the lime mixer, all arriving as if choreographed. There was no glory in this, only duty, and perhaps a kind of pride. They didn't wield swords or give speeches, but their calculations and quiet fixes kept the townsfolk safer than many realized. These were not the people featured in epic ballads, but if you've ever leaned against a stone wall hundreds of years old, you've rested against the results of their work. Puzzle piece. They made decisions that would last lifetimes. Is this arch too heavy for the support? If the river floods again, will this side collapse? How do we rebuild this tower so it doesn't lean in winter? Each answer required thinking not only in years, but sometimes in decades or centuries. It was a different pace of decision-making, born from a different kind of patience. To live in a fortified town was to trust these invisible minds, to believe that your safety was quietly being safeguarded by a set of hands you might never shake. And for the engineer, perhaps the greatest reward was knowing that no one noticed their work, because it meant everything was holding. You might think that living inside a fortified town would bring a constant sense of security. Thick stone walls, tall towers, and locked gates must surely have created an impenetrable bubble of peace, or so it would seem. But the truth, as is often the case in boring history, is much more quietly complex. The people who lived behind those walls, beneath those towers, and beside those gates knew both the comfort and the subtle unease that came with fortification. The sight of a guard walking the wall by torchlight could be calming, a sign that someone was awake while others slept. The creak of the wooden watchtower floorboards as boots paced back and forth in the darkness became part of the night soundtrack. Some children even fell asleep to that rhythm, lulled by its predictability. But what if the steps stopped? What if they were running instead? Those same torches could cast strange, flickering shadows that startle the eye. The clink of armor in the silence of midnight could send a ripple of anxiety through a household. Was it a drill or a sign? Even the most ordinary sounds could take on meaning. A dog barking too long, a knock on a gate after curfew, a messenger galloping in before dawn. These were not everyday occurrences, and their rarity gave them weight. The walls were both protectors and reminders. They kept danger out, yes, but they also meant that there was danger to be kept out. The presence of guards meant that threats existed. The act of locking the gate wasn't just about safety. It was an acknowledgement of risk. Inside the walls, life continued with quiet resilience. Townsfolk learned to live with the knowledge that they were watched, not just by guards, but by each other. In tightly packed streets, privacy was rare. Everyone knew who had visitors, who argued with whom, and who hadn't left their house in days. The watchmen themselves were often the most overlooked. Their job was to prevent something that might never happen. If they did their work perfectly, nothing occurred. No bells rang, no alarms were sounded, and life simply went on. Their vigilance became invisible. Some guards passed entire years without drawing a sword. Others never saw real battle at all. But they stood in rain and wind, in bitter frost and damp fog, night after night, watching the same empty hills, listening to the same forest rustle. There was a quiet nobility in it, a kind of patient heroism that didn't need to be remembered. These were not knights in shining armor or soldiers in tales of glory. They were ordinary men, paid modestly, tasked with the sacred job of waiting. The townsfolk relied on them more than they realized. And when danger did come, when a bell rang out or fire was spotted or footsteps echoed too fast on stone, it was these uncelebrated watchmen who reacted first. They were the thread between calm and chaos. And so, as you imagine the town now, sleepy under a blanket of stars, gates closed, lanterns flickering in windows, picture, too, the lone silhouette walking the outer wall. Not heroic, not dramatic, just there, just watching. And perhaps, as you rest at night, you might hear his footsteps in your mind, soft, steady, endlessly patient, as the world outside stays quiet a little while longer. So here we are, dear dreamer, at the end of another long, slow walk through time. You wandered tonight not to the grand halls of kings or the clamor of battlefields, but along the quiet corridors of ordinary lives, forgotten maybe, but not unimportant. Behind those high stone walls, life unfolded gently. There were pots bubbling with soup over firelight, and hands calloused from rope and rock. There were whispered jokes between neighbors, bells that rang at dusk, children laughing in narrow alleys. And even in fear, there was comfort, a kind of slow, heavy peace that only people used to long silences could understand. And now, you've heard it too. You've seen what most don't see, the layers of calm beneath the fortress, the steady rhythm of real life behind the battlements. It's a funny thing. We often imagine these places only when they're under siege. But in truth, they stood for decades without alarm. They held love, routine, even boredom. And in that quiet constancy, there's something deeply human, something worth remembering. So, as your eyes grow heavier and your mind begins to float away, imagine yourself curled beneath a woolen blanket on a straw-filled mattress. A candle flickers low on the wooden sill. Outside, the cold stone of the wall stands strong and unmoving. A guard's lantern swings in the distance. All is safe. All is still. You're part of that slow world now. The fire dies down, the sounds fade, and the past cradles you in its gentle, ancient arms. If this journey brought you peace, you're always welcome back. Leave a soft comment below. Tell us where you're listening from or what history lulls you to sleep. And if your dreams ever need a quiet companion, well, you know where to find a sleepy historian.